What is happening in Syria now? Who exactly is fighting who? Why is Israel getting involved? Questions you may well be asking yourself hearing the latest news from Damascus. We heard from our colleague Tim Franks earlier in the programme. He's producing a series for the World Tonight next week. Let's hear a bit more about the background to this outbreak of violence now, which began when civilians from the Druze community on the outskirts of Damascus were attacked. And Israel then attacked Syrian government targets. I've been speaking to Bill Wiley. He's executive director of what's called the Commission for International Justice and Accountability. He's a lawyer, in other words, a war crimes investigator who knows the country well and is there now investigating the crimes of the Assad regime and others in the country. When I spoke to him, he began by telling me more about who the Druze are.
The Druze are a minority sect. They're not followers of Islam, if you will, and they're a small part of the Syrian population. There's a diaspora, Lebanon, Israel, Syria in particular, and there's a small portion of the Syrian Druze that have not reconciled themselves to the new government in Damascus, and this is ultimately the root of the problem.
And the trigger to the problem this week was the alleged disrespect paid by that community to Muslims.
Well, there was an individual who posted a video on Facebook, an elderly man, although pictured himself quite heavily armed, who indeed insulted the prophet. And this gave rise to an armed mob, completely unconnected to the government, to go to that area of one of the Damascus suburbs, and the security forces, the public security forces in Syria, sought to keep the two groups apart, and ultimately fighting broke out between the security forces and this Druze faction.
It's interesting that you stress that they were unconnected with the government, because the moment that new regime took over after the fall of the Syrian dictatorship, there were voices heard in Israel and elsewhere which said, in effect, these guys are terrorists. These are people we should be scared of. And yet in this case, they're trying to keep the peace, are they?
They are trying to keep the peace. There's a couple of reasons for that. One is they're very, very sensitive to external criticism, particularly from the West, that they are going to foster or prolong the sectarian narrative that took hold during the prolonged war in Syria from 2011. And then the second issue is I know the government people quite well, at least professionally, and they do seem genuinely committed to ultimately having a non-sectarian state that is respectful of the various confessions and ethnic minorities in this country.
And yet it's clear, isn't it, that Benjamin Netanyahu, the Prime Minister of Israel, doesn't believe that and is carrying out pretty dramatic airstrikes on Syrian targets.
Yeah, there was some, after the fighting died down yesterday, there was some drone strikes. Oddly enough, they came after the fighting had effectively burned itself out in one of the suburbs. So I don't know the Israeli motivation. They had been flying surveillance drones the day before to keep an eye on things in this troubled spot within the city or on the outskirts of the city. And why they fired a few rounds in from the drones after, again, things had calmed down is not entirely clear to me or probably anyone else.
You know the new government. You clearly think they're serious about trying to maintain the peace rather than engage in a civil war. Do you think they're capable of doing so?
This is an excellent question. The fundamental issue is that the country is highly balkanized, both politically and militarily. There's armed factions all over the place. And in principle, the vast majority have sworn fealty to the new government, but as a practical matter, these individual power bases being inseparable from the military factions, well, it's going to take quite some time for this issue to resolve itself. The government is committed to doing this, again, clearly through political dialogue, and is trying to avoid fighting. And one of the reasons for that is it's a bad look externally when the government, majority Sunni, gets engaged against minority elements in the context of the government's desire to have sanctions relief from the U.S. and elsewhere in the West.
War crimes investigator Bill Wiley there talking to us from Damascus.